Welcome to another episode of the Ari Lewis Show here on Israel Sports and News Radio. We're also going to upload this episode to YouTube on the Nation of Israel YouTube page if YouTube allows that. Hopefully they will. And we'll also post this episode on Rumble. So we're excited to have the audience aboard and watch this episode. Tonight's guest is a lecturer at Machon Meir. He's also the founder of Vision. It's a pleasure to have on the program Yehuda Hakohen. Thank you for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
So I attended a organization lecture / group with you last week, a discussion group, concept of Galut, how should we approach Galut since we're in Israel, and how should we approach some of our customs. Tisha B'Av, of course, is a couple of days away. So first aspect I want to discuss is last names, because if you look at Tanakh, people generally did not have last names. Usually it was B'Av at some point. And now we have last names, and a lot of last names have a Galut influence, Christian, Muslim, etc. I know you changed your last name. I keep my last name, at least as of now. I want you to talk about the importance of last names and how there was an influence with the Galut, and should we do things differently now or should we not, etc.
Okay. Well, first of all, I don't want anyone to feel pressured towards any behavior one way or the other. I think it's important when we have this post-colonial conversation to acknowledge what happened to us, what changed, and then decide independently what we want to change back, if at all. I think that's important. Historically, we were known, we had names, like sometimes 2 or 3 names, but we had names. And then we were identified as either son of our father or from a place that we came from. Now, usually if we were no longer in that place, like for example, you have people sometimes in our history whose names change based on where they are geographically. But you have a guy from Beit El who moves to Jerusalem would be known as Beit Ha'eli, right? A guy from Jerusalem who moves to, Akko would be Yerushalmi, if that's how he's being identified. On my mountain, I'm the only Kohen. So I'm HaKohen, right? The Kohen. My wife, when she married me, did not become HaKohen because she's not a Kohen. Her Turat Zehut says Eshet Kohen, right? Wife of Kohen. And at least one of my daughters in school is called Bat Kohen because she's not a Kohen, right? So, yeah. So, but basically, it was either what you did. Your function in society. It could be profession. It could be, I don't know if being a Kohen is my profession, but it's definitely what I contribute to where I live. I'm the only one doing Birkat Kohanim on the mountain. So I'm the Kohen of the mountain. So I'm HaKohen. But if I were a scribe, they might call me HaSofer, right?
Ezra the Scribe is known as Ezra the Scribe, right? So.
But we didn't have, there were no Goldbergs. Right. Although a lot of those names, even though those names were imposed on us for European governments to be able to keep track of populations better, the whole concept of family names, the way we understand them today, especially in the Western world, began when European governments were just trying to have a sense of their own populations. We did, at that point, take names that actually were very relevant to to what we did in society or who we were, etc.
Like Goldberg could be from someone who worked in gold?
Perhaps, right.
Silversmith, that kind of thing.
Right. So people took names that were relevant in the way that historically our names were relevant. Yaakov's son might be son of Yaakov, Ben Yaakov, right? Jacob's son, etc. But today, the way last names function, it's not exactly our name structure. Like, I made the choice to return to a Hebrew name structure. I don't want there to be any distinction between my name in my quote-unquote real life and my name when I'm called up to the Torah for an Aliyah. Like, I want the same name, in both ways. And so, so I would introduce myself as my name, in some cases, son of my father's name, and HaKohen, because that's the way I'm called up. That's who I really am. And I think that's a way to... It's a way to live holistic Jewish lives.
It's also interesting when you look at names as far as literature, even secular literature, that Shakespeare wrote a book called Othello. There's a character named Michael Cassio. I remember thinking, that's interesting, he has a last name, because the other characters didn't, and we were taught in school, well, he was upper class, and that's why I got a last name. Was that part of European society that people had these last names to show that they were more distinguished, and then the Jews were influenced, perhaps, in that respect, to seem more distinguished to have a last name?
Maybe, I don't know. I never read Othello, and I had never heard that before. I didn't know that it started with the upper classes of society.
That was a theory. It's interesting, like, for example, the name Jessica, which was apparently invented by Shakespeare, but he eventually, apparently, got it from Tanakh.
Iska.
Right.
Sorry, Menu.
Right.
Right.
So it's interesting, a lot of these names, if you look throughout literature, Shakespeare, all these brilliant books, maybe a little anti-Semitic, but they usually have some type of Jewish origin, if you check it out. Okay, so basically, part of the idea is the Hebraized concept. A lot of the prime ministers did that. Golda Meir was Meyerson. And then David Ben-Gurion was David Green.
Well, sort of.
Okay.
Meaning what they did was they Hebraized their name, but maintained a Western name structure.
Okay.
What I did, I'm not arguing for it, you don't have to do it. What I did was I decided to Hebraize not just my name, but my name structure.
Okay.
As an act of decolonization.
Okay.
Now, that works for me, I like it, but if somebody else doesn't want to do it, that's okay.
Okay, so it's important to make that distinction, because Shimon Peres, Persky, that's Hebraized as far as taking a Western name, make it sound more Hebrew.
Right.
Okay. And what you're talking about, what you did is more of a concept.
Change the actual structure of it.
Okay.
And I think that's a good way to look at the state of Israel.
Okay.
Because it's not just, we don't just want to have like a Western nation state, but in Hebrew. We want the structure. We don't want the skin of the state of Israel to be Jewish. We want the skeleton and the organs to be Jewish. We want to actually change the structure of the state in such a way that it expresses our people's values and identity and its policies and institutions. And I'm of the belief that if we're able to do that, then we won't have these kind of what I would consider shallow fights over the skin. And I think there'd be actually, if we can make the structures of the state more expressive of our identity, I think there'd be a lot more room for even people who are not us, because I think then we can think about minority rights, not in the Western sense, but actually formulate what minority rights might look like from a Jewish perspective, and then have a model that, in my opinion, would probably be superior and more acceptable to non-Jews in our society than the Western concept of minority rights.
Okay, so that's part of the interesting distinction. When people get that, figure that out, concept of taking a Western name, make it sound Jewish or Israeli or Hebrew, etc. But that's not the same as what he did. The other thing we talked about last week, found an interesting concept where you mentioned this analogy of, let's say, some people broke into a family's house, God forbid, and they kept him captive for, let's say, 5 years. And let's say there was a child from 12 to 17, and they made her listen to music, certain type of music, eat certain type of food. Now, when that's done...
And rearrange the furniture.
Right? So that really struck a chord with me, not that I was held captive in that sense, but a lot of the music I like as a kid, nostalgia-wise, when I actually listen to it, like, I don't like these lyrics of what they mean. This is disgusting. But it reminds me of a time of innocence.
Sure.
So that's something that is, I don't know if people are aware of that or not. I want to know if you could expand more on that concept of what can we do with that? Like, if I like a certain song and it makes me happy, do I have to get rid of it? Or should I,
Right. So I maybe I'll just repeat the analogy for your viewers.
Yes.
Because I was just trying to explain how... very simply, how the post-colonial conversation should look.
Okay.
And I gave the example, as you were listening very well, of people invade not your house, somebody's house when they're 12 years old, and they rearrange the furniture and they force a certain kind of cuisine, let's just say vegan cuisine for argument's sake, and they force the family to listen to certain kind of music. And after 5 years, the family decides to revolt, and now this 12-year-old is 17. And after they revolt and they win against these, invaders who had been occupying their home for 5 years, it's not enough to free their home from the invaders, which is basically what Israel did in 1948, meaning we forced the British to leave. And the British, I would look at the British as an extension of the Roman Empire that had destroyed our civilization 2,000 years earlier. But so once the British are gone and we have political independence once again, it's not enough to just take down their flag and put our flag on their system, which is essentially what David Ben-Gurion did. What we need to do is actually have a conversation. So if we're going back to the analogy of this family, they have to ask, well, one part of the conversation is, where did the furniture used to be? That's one part of the conversation. And the second part is, do we want to put it back? Or maybe partially, meaning it's possible that you could say, well, even though they were the oppressor and even though we didn't want them here, they really understood interior decorating better than we did. And the same thing with the music. Like the music, as you said, the music might have been imposed on us by an oppressor, but at the same time, a 12-year-old going from 12 to 17 is having certain coming-of-age experiences that he or she might have nostalgia for, and that music would trigger that nostalgia, and therefore there's like a guilty pleasure of, I want to hear these songs even though it's the music of the oppressor, and that creates, of course, an inner conflict for a lot of people. But I think it needs to be part of the conversation. Same thing with cuisine. Like a vegan cuisine might be really healthy, and a person's body would adapt in 5 years to the vegan cuisine. But then once the occupier who's forcing that diet on us is gone, we might say, hey, wait a minute, we want to go back to eating the junk we were eating before. So these are all... It's important to understand that when we're having this conversation over, what is going to be the identity of our state, how do we actually return, tshuva, how do we actually return to being the nation that we're supposed to be, it's important to know we're not going backwards. It's not like some pre-colonial aspiration that we want to go, be a replica of our ancestors before the Romans destroyed us, but in the 21st century. There are things that have changed in the last 2,000 years, and we have to understand that some things are going to be different. We're just living in a radically different world than those who were here during the Greco-Roman period, and we have to rebuild Hebrew civilization in the era we're living in now.
Again, this is the Ari Lewis Show here on Israel Sports and News Radio. Hope everyone is enjoying this episode. I want to discuss this concept of certain things that we could go back to and certain things we can't. So this was a few years ago. I work in archaeology a number of years, and when I first started, there's a course of Pasuk when Avraham Avinu is buying a cave for Sarah Imenu to bury her in Hebron, and the Torah talks about foreign shekel. That at the time, for some reason, I was thinking the way it was now, like foreign coins. And then the archaeologist said, no, they didn't have coins with faces on them. That was part of the oppression, to put faces on the coins, or dictators and other people, etc. That was
we didn't do that. We didn't put faces on coins.
We did not. Yeah, it's not a Jewish thing to do that. What that was discussed in the Torah is a measurement of silver. And then when you go a little further, that it was a basic barter system. Sheep made clothing, and donkeys were like the cars of the time, and they had other things to make their homes out of. So is that possible to go back to a barter system, or is that, no, it's too late, it's over?
No, I don't think we're going to go back to a barter system. I do, like right now, the economy, the global economy is structured a certain way that I think is flawed, maybe better than a lot of what's come before it. But I do believe that part of Israel's rebirth, part of the Jewish people coming back to life after 2,000 years, is ultimately going to lead humanity into what I would call a post-capitalist world. Okay. Meaning that we can, even if we're going to make the argument that capitalism as a mode of production and exchange is better than anything that came before it, better than feudalism, better than slavery, still, I think humanity can do better, and we can create some kind of economic model. I mean, that's one of the things I think we have to work on here, creating a uniquely Hebrew economy. Certainly not one in which billionaires and corporations are able to buy politicians and control policies.
You think that happens? Maybe. Hopefully people appreciate that we're trying to express the truth and kind of get away from that a bit. But the idea of going through a barter system would be, that's part of the reason that Abraham had the such brachot, because he was able to function in an independent way. He was relying on Hashem. He was able to do business with people. It said that all his business partners, I think Midrash, that they all succeeded except for Aphrodite sold in the cave because he tried to cheat him, etc. So was the Torah trying to hint there's a purity in a barter system? I mean, is that one idea?
It could be. I don't know. I mean, that's a good idea.
Okay. All right.
I've never really thought about that, and I'm not sure a barter system can work today, but I'm open to new ideas.
In regards to, let's say, things that we could try to go back to before we were kicked out, what would be some examples that we could change?
Well, I think what we should be doing really is looking not at necessarily the exact structures or policies, although some of them might still be relevant, but the values they expressed.
Okay.
Meaning, for example, and this is a discussion, I don't claim to have the answer, we're coming up on a Shemitah year.
Right.
Right. So generally the way Shemitah works today in the state of Israel is everybody becomes, or not everybody, but let's probably us, a lot of people become very serious about what vegetables, what produce they do or don't buy, where it comes from, is it heter mechira, is it otzer bedin, right? Like what vegetables am I going to buy during the Shemitah year? But Shemitah is a lot bigger than that. Shemitah is also about...
What it represents too.
Well, first of all, what about wiping out people's debts? Shouldn't there be a law in this country that anybody who's in minus gets their minus wiped out in the Shemitah year? I mean, that's a conversation we should be having. I think by the way, if we were having these conversations, I remember a couple years ago on Yom Yerushalayim, member of Knesset Bezalel Smotrich got up at Merkaz Harav and started talking about a halachic state. Right? And people got very scared. People get very scared when you have that conversation. But one of the reasons people get very scared when you have that conversation is because what they're imagining is either a Jewish Iran or a giant Haredi community. And I think that if we want to change that perception, we need to focus on the aspects of what the Torah has to say about creating a society that actually meet people's needs. So speaking about how Shemitah can potentially impact us on a socioeconomic level might get people a little curious about what a halachic state could look like, or that banks shouldn't charge interest. That might get people a little bit interested. Wait a minute, there might be something here. And then you start to have conversations about, well, wait, maybe we're afraid of this halachic state idea because the banks and, other, powerful forces in this country don't want us to think in that direction. Like, for example, Shabbat is very much a class issue. We have these public debates over whether or not we should have public transportation or shopping centers open on Shabbat. But this whole conversation is coming from the perspective of those privileged enough to just get on a bus and go shopping. And nobody's talking about the person who's forced to drive the bus or work retail on the one day a week his children are home. So I think we need to really have these, and I think, by the way, a lot of the tech companies, the global tech companies that essentially use the state of Israel as a sweatshop for R&D, are very threatened by the idea of a society that kind of shuts down one day a week, that doesn't tweet, that doesn't do any Google searches. I mean, we're not thinking about how much money Google makes on every search. Like a society that just doesn't do that one day a week, I think that's very threatening. And there have been people, I don't know if this is true, there have been people who've suggested that it could be some of these tech companies are actually funding a lot of the political agitation for opening up Shabbat.
You always said pollution, said a politician. I think it's a Freudian slip.
I said the political agitation, right?
Okay.
Towards actually opening up Shabbat and making it like a regular day.
Okay.
I think that there are people who have, I haven't seen evidence for it, but there are people who have made the claim that some of the money for that advocacy is coming from tech companies who just don't like the idea of a country shutting down. So I think one of the questions we'd have to ask, and I don't know the answer, but it's definitely been suggested at our, on our magazine. We have a magazine, visionmag.org. If anybody's interested, Vision Magazine, visionmag.org. It's in English. One of the writers there, Michael Shepsis, has written a couple articles about what Shemitah could potentially mean, or what a Hebrew economy could potentially look like in the modern age. And one of the questions he asks, and it's a good question, is, does all production shut down? Meaning, in ancient times, when we first came into this land, our economy was very agriculturally based. And stopping all agricultural work was basically shutting down our economy for a year, right? There was very little going on if we stopped all agricultural work. So does that mean, and here's the question, if we're going to implement Shemitah really in the modern age, would that mean shutting down all non-essential production for a year? It's a question.
Even that's not farm related.
Right, meaning high tech. Meaning we would just take a year off.
Kind of like the COVID year, sort of.
Ish.
Ish.
Yeah. Meaning, so we had a COVID year, which might have been like a sabbatical for a lot of people, but these are real questions. And so again, I don't claim to have the answers to all this, but I'm interested in us having a collective conversation over what a Hebrew civilization looks like in the 21st century. Because I do believe that we came back to life after 2,000 years in order to build that, and I do believe that what we ultimately build when we get it right is going to be something that inspires humanity and actually changes the world.
So you think part of the reason people might be scared to have that conversation is because they picture people being thrown off rooftops and that kind of thing, like death penalty being imposed, let's say people breaking Shabbat, and then people just, I don't want to talk about that, that's too scary, and forget it?
I mean, I think that's like the media depiction. The media depiction of it. But again, I don't know if the conversation starts with halachic state, but we definitely, put it this way, halachic state might have a lot of baggage. That concept might have a lot of baggage. I'm interested in a state that expresses our people's identity and values in its policies and in its institutions. So, Shabbat as a class issue is a good example. Shemitah as having socioeconomic ramifications, banks not charging interest. I also think our, defense industry should not be selling weapons to human rights violators abroad. Like these are all, these are all questions about our identity. And so I think that our identity and our values should be expressed. And the way I, envision the Jewish character of our state when we finally get it right is a Jewish character that's a lot softer, yet deeper than the Jewish character of our state right now. Like I'd say right now, Israel is like a European-style nation state with Jewish decorations. And those Jewish decorations are way too Jewish for the non-Jews in our country. And they're not Jewish enough for the Haredim. Right? So, I think instead of a shallow, hard Jewish character, I think our country can have a soft and deep Jewish character that every Haredi child would recognize as Jewish, like he would see the Jewishness in every policy and institution, and non-Jews would barely notice it's Jewish because they just, see a well-run country where they're given inclusion and equality.
Regarding banks charging interest, because I remember hearing this a while ago, that they argue some loophole, and I don't know if you're familiar with that, but there are ways that people do these type of things and make business deals, and they take a loan and they charge interest, but they do a roundabout way. You'd like to get rid of that idea.
Well, I think, again, for me, it's not necessarily about what we do. Those are important conversations to ultimately have, and eventually we're going to have to figure out what the policies should be. But I think the conversation should really begin with the values being expressed.
Okay.
So, I understand that when a lot of these loopholes came into being, we were in a very different situation, right? And we were a much more vulnerable community here, economically, militarily, right? Today, I think we're not in as vulnerable a situation, so we could think about what is ideal, what is best. And that's where I'd like to focus. What do we actually want if we're not concerned about, about this project failing? Then what is the ideal? What should really be expressed through the policies and institutions of the state? So a loophole might have been necessary at one point, but ultimately what the loophole does, it allows the banks or the lenders or whatever to function in a way that were meant not to function because of the human cost, because of what it does to people. And I think that eventually the ideal is to get to a point where we're not interested in the loopholes. We're interested, for me also, this might just be the way I relate to mitzvot in general. The way I relate to mitzvot are, an opportunity to express my soul, an opportunity to really, behave according to the divine ideal, and to express the divine ideal through the finite vehicles that we call halacha, that we call the mitzvot. So ultimately, what I'd like to see is a state that a country or some kind, whatever we call it, kingdom, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, that expresses a divine ideal in every sphere of human behavior, from sanitation and social services to diplomacy and the judiciary, even warfare if necessary. But everything is an expression of kedusha.
Because there are ways that a person could do the mitzvot with loopholes and technically do it, but not really ideally do them. Like with Shabbat, if a person wanted to have a little bit of bread and that's it, well, I did the Sudat Shabbat according to halacha, but that's not really the intention. You're saying that...
Right, I'm saying we want to do things mahadran. Like we want to do things in a way that we feel like we're really expressing our souls in this world. That's what it's worth. For me, the Torah is just an external Well, first of all, it's our soulmate, like the land of Israel is our soulmate. But it's also an external instruction manual for how to live according to my soul. Meaning the Avot, our ancestors, our patriarchs and matriarchs, they lived the Torah without the book. Right? They just lived Torah, right? Like Avraham ate matzah on Pesach, right? Before we left Egypt, before we even went to Egypt. So they didn't need the book. They were just healthy enough to live their internal natures. I want to live my internal nature, and the best means I have for doing that is the Torah.
Okay, this is the Ari Lewis Show here on Israel Sports News Radio. It's also, of course, on YouTube as well, hopefully, the Nation of Israel YouTube page. I want to talk about a concept of translation because, again, depending on a person's approach to the Galut, you could look at translation as a bad thing or good thing. Of course, initially, the 8th of Tevet was a fast day because the Torah is translated in Greek. But as you see, we're speaking English right now. It's still the world's language. It's part of the reason we're speaking English, so people worldwide can learn these values we're talking about and get some more knowledge about Israel. What is your particular view about translation? Is it a point where, since it's out there, we should just kind of roll with it, or should we try to move away with it? That would be more an insular idea, but I want to get your thoughts on it.
I think it depends on which. I think there are some that are actually conceptually problematic.
Okay.
A big one is God, right? When we think of God,
it's a German word,
right? Right, and it's a very Christian concept.
Right.
What we have a relationship with a creator that we call, I don't want to spell his name, but Yud and then Hey and then Vav and then Hey, which is a combination of 3 words, was, is, and will be.
Right.
So we basically have this ultimate timeless reality without end that creates all and is the author of history and has a unique relationship with us and and gives us a Torah. And I think it does a disservice to that relationship and that concept of when we import this word God, which is, I think, carries a lot of Christian baggage. People get this image of a invisible, all-powerful giant, sometimes with a beard.
Long white beard.
Right? And that's not, and that's not healthy. I think we need to understand that we're really talking about the source of all, the soul of all souls, the infinite whole that we're all a part of. Much more of a panentheist perspective maybe than a monotheistic perspective. He's not separate from us. We're all expressions of him, and ultimately I think the purpose of history, the goal of all this is to bring all of creation to the awareness that we're all one, that we're all expressions of that infinite whole, that timeless ultimate reality, and that the more we know ourselves, it's not for the purpose of really even knowing him, it's to know ourselves, to fully live ourselves, to fully express our souls in this world, in this life, and to feel like we're actually doing what we were put into this world to do. And to realize that we're really all connected at the source, and that we want to bring humanity to that awareness. And of course, the way to do that is really through the unique story of the children of Israel, right? The prophet Yeshayahu says, "Amzu yitzati li tisaperu," like this nation have I created to sing my praise. Well, sing my praise doesn't mean we're going to write songs and sing about the Creator, but rather the story of our people, just because it's such an incredible, phenomenal story, by looking at that story, by really thinking about examining that story, trying to understand the story of Israel through all of the trials and tribulations and downs and ups and destructions and overcoming and comebacks, the whole thing really will bring people to the awareness that there is an author to the story and a purpose to the story, and that through the understanding that there is a purpose and an author and a goal to human history, will also come to the awareness that we're really all one.
Well, let's say translation in terms of, like, in this country, the main language is modern Hebrew. I like to point that out. Ben Yehuda created Elazar Ben Yehuda about 120 years ago, approximately. And that's not really authentic Hebrew.
Is it? I don't know. I think it is. I think that's what Am Yisrael speaks. And I think that Look, is modern English the same language as Shakespearean English?
I'd say it's different.
Well, it's languages
Extension,
evolve.
maybe.
I mean,
Okay.
our civilization is thousands of years old, and I think languages evolve, and in some in some ways maybe more positive than others. But I think that, put it this way, I think that if one of our ancestors from the biblical period were to come here in a time machine with his biblical Hebrew, people might think he's a little weird, but he'd probably be able to get by and communicate.
But in regards to the influence of colonization, that has had effect on modern Hebrew because there's words in there that are clearly French or German or English.
Okay, well, we had also Aramaic words. I mean, that's not a new thing, but yeah, I mean, we had, right. But I don't have so much a problem with that. I think what you mentioned earlier, these like English, I'll give you another English word that's really problematic: conversion or convert. Usually, for thousands of years, we have a concept of giur, where a person who's not one of us, a person who's not a descendant of the tribes of Israel, wants to join the people of Israel, and there's been this ritual process that he or she undergoes in order to become a Hebrew, which from a Kabbalistic perspective means receiving a piece of our collective soul, ultimately. Like it's an internal transformation. And when we say, and it's joining a people, not joining a religion. It's not like becoming a Muslim or becoming a Christian. Becoming a Jew is a whole different, it requires a transformation to the point that we consider that person to be now a son or a daughter of Avraham and Sarah. And I think the word conversion implies just joining a religion. So it's a problematic. Another one is prayer, by the way. Like lehitpalel is not the Christian concept of prayer. And I think a lot of these words, like you said before, a lot of these English translations of Hebrew concepts can trip us up. So it's important. I think, look, we can use English and we can teach in English, and I think there's a very large audience that needs to be taught in English. But I think it's also important to clarify that some of these words don't mean what you think they mean.
Okay. And that's part of the generation we're in. There's a lot of people from the Galut, they come to Israel, they're used to the native languages, that's their understanding. In fact, nullifying chametz for Pesach is preferred to do it in the person's native language. There's a couple examples. Once it gets into Jewish law that we use it. Rosh Hashanah is going to have some tefillot that are not in Ivrit, in Aramaic, and different reasons. So it's interesting how it comes into our culture and our religious practices. Okay, this is the Ari Lewis Show here on Israel Sports and News Radio, also on the YouTube channel, hopefully, The Nation of Israel. Of course, we'll see what happens with that. Let's talk about the concept of colonization effects on Israel in terms of the political landscape. This structure we have in politics is not, I mentioned this before, it is not necessarily Jewish or indigenous to Israel. It is a concept that apparently came from England, and we're still using it. Give us your thoughts about that.
The parliamentary system.
Yes.
Right. This is not only unique to us. I think if you look at India, for example, they're also using a British political system that just doesn't really work for their culture or identity. And that's true with us as well. We just had 4 elections in 2 years. I might be one of the rare individuals who wants a 5th. But part of it is because we don't have a political system that really fits our identity properly. And even within that political system, I think there are often measures taken. Like, for example, when politicians, usually from larger parties, want to raise the electoral threshold to the point, when I moved here, there were Knesset members, there were parties in our Knesset that had 1 seat.
Right.
When I moved here. Yeah. Now, to get into Knesset, you need 4 seats. You need enough votes for 4 seats worth of votes in order to get into Knesset. Now, if you say that part of our identity, part of our culture, is 2 Jews, 3 opinions, then if we're going to have a parliamentary system, it should have lots of small ideological parties. That would be expressive of our identity. Right? We need a system that's expressive of our identity for it to work. And this kind of attempt, especially by the larger parties, to kind of inch closer and closer to kind of these like big tent, like almost like an American-style 2-party system, I think is really problematic and dangerous and undemocratic. Although I'd also argue that most political systems are always struggling between the values of democracy and efficiency.
Right, that's what you mentioned last week. Right. The dictator is very efficient, but it's not democratic.
Right. And so I would favor for Israel a participatory democracy based on the captains of 10 model that was actually also introduced to us from the outside. Meaning, there are outside influences that are good. Meaning, when we left Egypt, we left with gold. Now, usually in the Torah, gold, as opposed to silver usually means wealth, like material wealth. But gold often, when the Torah speaks of gold, it usually refers to like cultural values and ideas and ideals. And when we left Egypt, we left with gold. Some of that gold went to contribute to the Mishkan, and some of that gold went to contribute to the golden calf. Now, the way I understand that, and even Rashi, when he talks about this concept of amskula, he refers to Israel as like this treasure trove that goes around the world collecting treasures, ideas, wisdoms from different nations, like in exile, and eventually will come back. So there's a value to some of the foreign ideas we pick up, but we have to sift. And the sifting mechanism has to be our identity. So as long as we're strong in our identity, if we understand our own story deeply, then I think we'll have the filtration mechanism to know what foreign influences are the Mishkan and what foreign influences are the golden calf. But they're not all bad or all good. Some are conducive to us being able to fulfill our role in history, and some are not. And some get in the way. So we have to be able to know. But Yitro, who is from Midian, introduces this political structure to us of captains of 10, hundreds, thousands, etc., that we seem to use from then on. And I think we can create here a participatory democracy along the lines of that model. Meaning that, let's say on my mountain, 10 guys get together every Sunday night and meet about everything from road safety, schools, education, transportation, defense, diplomacy, and choose one guy, let's say in this case it's me, and I'm a captain of 10. That means I go to a second meeting Monday night with 9 other captains of 10s from 9 other neighborhoods or in the area or mountaintops or whatever. And let's say we have the same conversations and everybody's representing their 9 guys from their neighborhood. And then you have a captain of hundreds. Then he goes to a meeting Tuesday night with 9 other captains of hundreds, right? And then somebody becomes captain of thousands, and then somebody goes into Knesset. And every week you can recall your captain. He can stay a member of your group, but he's no longer your representative if he doesn't do what you sent him to Parliament to do. That would be a participatory democracy which involves everybody. Meaning for me, democracy means empowering people to be able to influence the structures they live under. That's what's important to me. I don't care about votes. I don't care about election days. In many cases, voting becomes an illusion of democracy in systems that aren't really democratic at all. Because if you're voting for one of 2 people who are essentially the same person with the same background, same education, okay, maybe they have differences of opinions on distraction issues, but for the most part, they're coming from the same backgrounds, they're getting their campaign funding from the same corporations and lobbyists, and no matter who wins, he's going to be much more beholden to the corporations that funded his campaign than he will be to the people who voted for him. And everybody else has to shut their mouths for 4 years until it's time to vote again, and by then you have the corporations and lobbyists writing checks to everybody to get their face on billboards and their name on the radio, etc. So I would rather have a system where anybody who's a decision maker has to be involved on a weekly basis. You don't have to be involved. You could stay home, you can watch TV, you could smoke a joint, you can hang out with your kid, whatever you want to do. But if you're going to be part of the system, you're showing up and you're discussing everything. So you eliminate what we call the soft voter. You eliminate the uneducated voter who's just told he has a civic duty to vote for the guy with the best hair. And you end up with a lot of really educated people who are discussing the most pressing issues of our society on a weekly basis and coming to informed decisions and sending representatives to Parliament, and the next week having the ability to recall those representatives if they didn't do what they're sent to do, and replacing them with somebody else around the table. I think that would be a much more democratic system, and I think a country as small as Israel could actually be a good place to really experiment with that model.
It's interesting you bring up the concept of the 2 political system, party system in America, and it's basically the same thing, because I was covering a protest in 2003, anti-war protest, go for war, etc. And, I said, it was kind of a hippie gentleman type of guy, I said, look, this is your fault. He's like, what do you mean? You voted for Ralph Nader, and if you didn't vote for Ralph Nader, Gore would have won, and then there wouldn't be a war. And he said, that's not true. there still would have been a war.
He might be right.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I tend to think things do go in patterns, especially with leadership. There's a concept that the leader has less of a free will concept, we say,
Right.
but I think that might be a concept that there's things in patterns. So is that kind of bit what you're talking about, where people say, oh, if we would have voted him, we wouldn't have the war? Maybe we would have anyway.
Right, I agree.
And we also, regards the captives of tens, was that, in your opinion, what the House of Representatives was trying to do?
I don't know.
Okay.
What they were trying to do is a good question for them. I'm concerned about here. And even, by the way, even if we find that a lot of the political structures or ideas of Western civilization are at some point influenced by the ancient Hebrews, which you have.
Yeah, sure.
You have certainly many examples of this. Still, I don't think we're looking to copy of our own thing.
Right, okay.
I think ultimately we want to really think about what our authentic thing is that we can. We might need to update it to the 21st century, but I don't think we should just be copying a copy of our thing.
Right, there's a movie called Multiplicity where they have a character that copies himself 4 times, and by the time they get the 4th, it's just not so good.
It's like a game of telephone.
Yeah,
Right.
it ends up being less authentic, less pure, right?
Right.
Again, this is the Ari Lewis Show here on Israel Sports and News Radio, also on the Nation of Israel YouTube channel as well, and Rumble as well. Hope we're joining the program this evening. So let's talk about Tisha B'Av. Of course, I mentioned a couple of days away. What would be your approach at this point, in the sense that the Beit HaMikdash is not up, but good portion of world Jewry in Israel, approximately, I think it's over 40%. So it's not where we want it to be, but certainly better than things were 80 years ago, obviously. So your thoughts on the approach to Tisha B'Av coming up in a couple of days?
Well, I think for me, Tisha B'Av and the 9 days and the 3 weeks approaching, and it just keeps intensifying as you get closer, is a good time for 2 things. Number 1, to focus on what's missing. Right? We for most of the year, we appreciate the fact that we've come back to our land, we've regained independence, we've revived our language, we have many challenges and many things to overcome, but at the same time, compared to much of our history, we're doing pretty good. Better than we have been doing in a long time.
Yeah.
So I think we can appreciate that, and the trajectory seems to be good. But at the same time, there are still things missing. And I think this is a good time of year to focus on what's missing, what's incomplete, what's flawed, what we want to change in our society. That's number 1. Number 2, I think it's a good time to learn the story of our fight for freedom against the Roman Empire. And this is an important story because for much of our history, the heroes of the story, the Judean freedom movement, whether it's the Sikari or the Zealots or what we'll call the broader Zealot movement or the Fourth Philosophy, were essentially vilified. They were vilified by Josephus in his writings, and they were even vilified by our Chachamim in the Talmud, or many of them, not all, but many of the Chachamim, because really after that war, after Jerusalem was destroyed and the Romans won, there was a debate going on within the empire. People in Antioch and Alexandria were lobbying for wholesale punishment of the Jews throughout the empire. And I think both Josephus and the rabbis had an interest in trying to convince the Romans that this was not a conflict between Rome and Jerusalem. This was a situation of a fanatical minority picking a fight with the Roman Empire and victimizing the Jews at the same time. That was kind of the way it was framed in order to kind of get the Jews off the hook after the war had ended. And, I think both Josephus and the rabbis wanted the Romans to make a very clear separation between the Jewish people and the Zealot movement, which I don't think really exists. That separation is true, because I think on the one hand, even Josephus tells us that in the first century, the Zealot philosophy, the Fourth Philosophy, was the most popular philosophy in all of Judea, especially among the youth. He says there's no difference between the Pharisee movement and the Zealot movement, except for the fact that the Zealots believe that we have a Torah obligation to conquer the land of Israel, to free it from Roman rule, and to maintain Jewish independence, and to accept Roman rule in our land is idolatry. And therefore, that's the position of the Ramban, certainly in his commentary, a supplement to the Rambam's Sefer Mitzvot. That's also the Shulchan Aruch in Even Ezer Siman Ayin Hey. The Pitrei Tshuva there, I think it's Vav, says all the Rishonim and all the Achronim hold by the Ramban on this issue, that it's a mitzvah in every generation to liberate our land, to establish Jewish independence, and to not let any of it fall into foreign hands. So the Zealot position is and certainly I think our ancestors in the time of Tanakh held this way. But for some reason, because the Zealot movement ultimately lost, and I'm not saying it was a perfect movement, they definitely made mistakes, as all of our heroes have made mistakes. It was an imperfect movement, but because they lost, they didn't get to really write their own history. They didn't get to write their own story. The story was written about them by political opponents, by the Romans, by Josephus, and by Rabbanim, who had an interest in protecting us, like for good reason, protecting us from the wrath of the Roman Empire, which was considerable. But now that we're back and now that we're free, I think we have an obligation to really learn that story more deeply and to understand what they were fighting for, what they were fighting against. It wasn't only an anti-colonial struggle or anti-imperial struggle, it was also a class struggle, meaning, Shimon Bar Giora, who the Romans recognized ultimately as the leader of the Judean revolt, he freed the slaves and wiped out debts, and even the Zealot movement in Jerusalem, which is mostly like the lower class Kohanim, burned down the Hall of Debts, like to alleviate everybody's debt. I would think we need to look at the Zealot movement as a very important link in a chain of many Jewish liberation movements that ultimately culminated with the fighters for the freedom of Israel who forced the British to leave our land. And now we have to ask ourselves, what are the goals of Jewish history moving forward? Meaning, we've come back to a situation of power, which we haven't had in thousands of years. We have to figure out what that looks like, how to use power, how to be comfortable with power, not to abuse it, and at the same time, not to be afraid of using it. And I think that a lot of the political friction in Israeli society comes down to those who want to quote-unquote abuse it versus those who are afraid to touch it at all. I think we have to be comfortable with power, and we have to ask ourselves, what are the goals of Jewish history? What's already been achieved? What's left to accomplish? What's standing in the way? And what can we do to be characters in the story of smashing those obstacles and actually advancing Jewish history forward? So throughout our history, it's almost always a radical minority of Jews who advance our people's story forward. The Zealots are a good example. The Maccabim were a good example. The Lehi was a good example. But I would say Bar Kokhba and Rabbi Akiva certainly attempted. But I would argue that a lot of us don't learn that between Bar Kokhba and Herzl, there were many Jewish liberation movements that attempted to advance our people's story forward that failed. They were links in the chain, but they failed to taste victory themselves. But the more we learn about these movements and the more we identify with these movements, I think the more we'll be able to live those kinds of lives and actually be the type of Jews who get to advance our people's story forward.
But how do we balance the concept of avoiding foreign influence, and then, as you said earlier, the concept of we take gold from the Egyptians that we could get good things out of it? How do we do that balance?
Well, the balance is through knowing our identity.
Okay.
Our identity is the filtration mechanism. Or I would say it this way, learning emunah. We're sitting here in Machon Meir, which is a yeshiva in the path of Rav Kook. And one of the most important innovations of Rav Kook in the Beit Midrash was learning emunah be'iyun. Like learning emunah, not just like having emunah as some like fluffy thing, but actually learning emunah, developing emunah, learning how to see the world a certain way, learning how to understand the events around us a certain way, learning how to understand Torah a certain way. And I think the more we learn our identity, to understand our identity, and the more we learn emunah, that will be the filtration mechanism that will allow us to sift between the positive gold and the negative gold, the foreign influences that can be conducive to us fulfilling our mission, and the foreign influences that could be an obstacle to fulfilling our mission.
So there is a way to use foreign influence properly. So.
Yeah,
Okay. And it's actually interesting because, as I mentioned, there was a fast day set up when the Torah was translated to Greek, but if you apparently look at the 8th page of Megillah, the Torah today can be read in Greek, which is a pretty interesting message that there's a way to use these things properly. Again, this is the Ari Lewis Show here at Israel Sports News Radio, also uploaded to YouTube, hopefully, the Nation of Israel YouTube page. Let's talk about the concept of more foreign influence in terms of goods and services. It's I know you're from the United States, and me as well, and at least in this lifetime, and there was always a taboo for a Jewish person to ride in a German car. There were a lot of Jews like, I'm not riding a German car. Even if they ate bacon, they just did something they wouldn't do. We come to Israel, we get on a bus, it's Mercedes. These German cars are part of the government, and it's a very weird situation. So give us your thoughts about that. Is it just, well, that's business. We get a good deal from the Mercedes dealership, so that's what we're going to do, or should we stay away from that? What do you think?
Well, that's an old debate in this country that was decided in the early 50s.
Okay.
That was a major disagreement between Mapai, led by David Ben-Gurion, and Chirut, led by Menachem Begin.
Okay.
Right?
Let me take us. Begin didn't want to use the Mercedes.
No, they were right. He was actually banned from the Knesset for a period of time because he led riots in the streets against taking reparations from Germany.
Wow.
But again, this is the early 1950s, meaning that to say the wounds were fresh would be an understatement.
Yeah.
Now, for you and I imagine, I'm 41 years old, I imagine you're somewhere in that neighborhood. We probably grew up at a time, well, I did, you probably did as well, when we knew people who had been through the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And it was still, it wasn't yet history. It was still a real thing.
Sure.
And there was still we still heard stories, not just new people. I mean, today maybe they're geriatric survivors, but when I was growing up, there were people in their 60s, who were survivors and who had very clear memories and can tell stories, and I think that's a different world. I think in a world where it's just become history, the taboo on buying German products or riding in German cars is much less. I mean, if we think about all of the German companies that benefited materially from the Holocaust,
Sure.
whether we're talking about
like IBM.
Right. Well, I don't. Right.
Is that okay to say that? Sorry.
Right. Well, there's also American companies.
Sure.
That's another conversation.
Right.
But when you think about, although I don't know how many American companies were actually like stuffing the car seats with Jewish hair, or making lampshades out of Jewish skin, or making bars of soap out of Jewish fat, but they were certainly benefiting materially from the Holocaust as well. But we're so removed from that today. We're living. The people who are growing up today and deciding, Jews who are growing up today and deciding to buy a German car, aren't really relating to the Holocaust as something that's like real or relevant, meaning it's not the same Germans.
Is that a legitimate point? I
don't know. It's tough. I think it feels, and maybe this was Begin's point when he opposed the reparations, it feels like we did not receive justice. Something happened to us. Another nation, or maybe collection of nations, perpetrated a horrendous, not just crime, atrocities on us. And we like to think we moved on. I mean, certainly we're in a better position today than we were then, radically. But I don't know if we can, like for example, the Eichmann trial, when Adolf Eichmann was kidnapped by the Mossad and brought to stand trial in Jerusalem, that was a very symbolic moment for our people.
Sure.
But it wasn't justice.
How could it be? He's responsible for 6 million Jews dying. You can't execute them 6 million times in this world. So
right. So I think that, and again, it's not for me. This conversation isn't about taking revenge, although there were attempts right after the war to poison the German water supply and things like that. This, for me, is not a conversation about taking revenge. This is a conversation, for me, about being able to overcome our own trauma in order to move on. I think that's important for us. And the Holocaust might have been the culmination of a series of traumatic events that we went through. But ultimately, now that we're back here, again, this is part of this post-colonial conversation I think we really need to have. We need to unpack our trauma, especially Ashkenazim. We really need to acknowledge what happened to us, how it affected us, in some cases, we're just going to move on with it. In some cases, we're going to try to change what was done to us or put back what was before. These are all fluid conversations that we need to have, but we need to have them. We need to unpack our trauma for our sake, for the sake of the other people living in this country with us, for the sake of our neighbors.
And for the sake of future generations.
Yeah, and for the sake of future generations. We haven't really faced our trauma yet. We haven't really unpacked it. And I think that, the conversation over whether or not to purchase or ride in a German car will be a much easier conversation to have once we've unpacked that trauma.
And something I want to make clear, my experience, once I got to Israel, I was in Ulpan, and there were 3 non-Jewish Germans. And I've had a lot of positive experience with Germans in this country and worldwide. So I have very mixed feelings. For example, Henry Ford was known as a huge anti-Semite. Then his son apparently sponsored a yeshiva somewhere in New York. It's called the Henry Ford Yeshiva.
Okay.
There are things like that happen where the grandchildren will acknowledge bad things. The grandchildren of Nazis will acknowledge that they did wrong and try to do things correctly. So IBM now, I'm sure, is a lot different than they were in the 40s. So
Disney,
there's different situations where people can change. I don't want to sound naive. I don't know if they're changing for sure, if it's fake, it's not. I don't know, but we do believe that people can change. So this is a possibility.
So Germans, in my experience, seem to be very adamant about the fact that they've changed, and there seems to be a lot of breastfeeding over what took place during the Second World War. But sometimes it feels like even their even that, I don't want to say tshuva, even that penitence carries a little bit of arrogance and is even a little ethnocentric. Sometimes I experience or I pick up on a little bit of German superiority in how they're no longer seeing themselves as a master race. Meaning they've evolved from that. They've evolved from it, but no one else has.
Oh, I see. I mean, it's, for example, a couple years ago I was at the hotel, and I go there a lot, obviously, and there were a couple of non-Jewish Germans that were asking questions, very respectful, and they asked me, can I go up and touch it? Very respectful, so...
Yeah, no, they're good. Look, first, they're good people everywhere, bad people everywhere, but I think part of our problem, it's not even necessarily their problem, part of our problem is we've never had a real...
conversation.
We haven't had closure. I don't think we've had any closure. And I think to a certain extent, we've used the Shoah as a tool, both in the United States especially, to keep young Jews in the fold somehow, to keep them committed to Jewish identity, which I think is a very negative tool, a very problematic tool to use. But it became almost like a guilt tool, because of the Holocaust, you have to go to Hebrew school, or you have to marry a Jew, or whatever it is. And we've used it as a tool, overused it as a tool to gain sympathy from other nations. And I think other nations are sick of that.
There's apparently a drinking game where there was a prime minister giving a speech, and they said, we're going to drink every time he mentions the Shoah. There is stuff like that prime ministers will do that to try to get sympathy, as you mentioned, and that's probably not an angle we want to go with.
Right. No, not at this point. Right. I think in the 1950s, look, if it's the 1950s or 60s or 70s or maybe even 80s, and a German diplomat is dictating to us what we should do, especially if it's something that we feel is not in our interest, then I think bringing up the Shoah might be appropriate, especially since we're talking about a time where our national leaders were survivors, and the German national leaders were likely there, in some shape or form. Right. Then it becomes, relevant history to bring up. Today, I'm not talking about forgetting. I'm not talking about forgiving. We have to unpack. We need closure, but I don't think it should be used cynically as a political tool, or even as an educational tool. Okay,
meaning in the sense that obviously we need to learn about it, but to not say we need to do certain.
Not to use it to guilt children into being Jews. I think look, we're living in one of the most exciting chapters of Jewish history. For the first time in thousands of years, we are back in our land, not as a gas, but as a solid. We have political independence. We have a government. We have an army. We have an economy. We have a lot of challenges to overcome. But I think inspiring our youth to be characters in this story and feel empowered to be the thought leaders in overcoming these challenges is a much better way to keep people involved and keep people Jewish than to guilt them about the Holocaust.
See, the guilt, it's interesting that you bring that up because there's this analogy, a story where once upon a time this son comes home and he says to his dad, someone tried to missionize me to become a Christian. And the father was a hardcore atheist. And he said, listen to me, son, there's only one God, but we don't believe in him. And it's this idea of like, well, we're not really pro-Jewish, we're anti not Jewish, and it gets very confusing as a child. Well, wait, I should just be Jewish because I'm not Christian? That doesn't really work. You can't really just be anti-something all the time.
Although there's something to that. There's something to just rejecting idolatry, even if we're not going to practice our own thing.
Okay, but in general, is that long-lasting? Something we have to, those people have to take on more mitzvah, right?
Ideally. I mean, again, it's for me, look, again, like I said, the mitzvot for me are a way to really express my soul in this world. Like through the character that I play, Yehuda Hakohen, I'm expressing my inner self. I'm expressing my soul through the mitzvot. I want that for other people as well. I think it's a good feeling, especially when you come with that approach. But at the very least, don't betray your soul. Don't stain your soul. And obviously, embracing Christianity would be a pretty destructive stain on the soul.
For a Jewish soul?
Yeah, maybe even a non-Jewish soul.
All right. Well, he said that, not me. We have a lot of Christian fans, but obviously we appreciate your special point of view on it.
Well, we can introduce them to the 7 Noachide laws.
There you go. Yeah. All right. So we can put a link actually in the section to that. Again, this is the Ari Lewis Show here on Israel Sports and News Radio, also on the YouTube channel, hopefully the Nation of Israel YouTube page. So let us discuss, you were mentioning this concept of it being empowered and certain things that we need to do, Jewish values. One of the things I bring up a lot is we're not doing such a good job in using the land that we have. I'm talking about the borders that we have right now, the state of Israel. My guess on the top of my head is maybe we use 20% of the land. I mean, I don't know the exact numbers, but it is just not really such a great situation, and for both Jews and non-Jews. There's plenty of land as now for 9 million people to live very comfortably here. And that's not, Jerusalem's very crowded, Tel Aviv's very crowded, Tel Aviv, they're both very expensive cities. So your thoughts on how we can do more land expansion in a proper way where, we're doing the right with things.
I'm afraid I don't have any novel opinions on this. Like I haven't really struggled with the issue.
Okay.
So, if you want to send me some links, things to read, I'm happy to. In general, I think that there's a lot of, like you said, a lot of undeveloped land. And one thing I will say is as long as we're functioning within a two-state paradigm, and we think that everything is like a fight over what's going to be ours and what's not going to be ours, we're going to politicize land issues and approach them in ways that might actually not be in our long-term interest. So I think the first thing we need to do is acknowledge that the two-state thing is over. That's not happening. Like we're not going to divide this land. And once we know that this is going to be one land, then we can approach these things in a way that is more conducive with the ideal, with our long-term interests and the kind of society we want to create, and not this kind of narrow-minded game over who's going to have what if the land gets divided.
Because in that situation, you're saying that it's kind of like it's hard to make a commitment if you're not sure the land's going to stay. Is it that kind of idea?
That and the fact that one thing I like about living in the Shtachim in Judea is how underdeveloped it is. You see nature everywhere. Whereas, when you go into the Merkaz, everything seems to be developed, or overdeveloped sometimes. So I think there's something to just like not conquering nature, working with nature.
Because like the way Jerusalem is now, basically they're building up. It's I won't say it's Manhattan, but it's closer to Manhattan than it was 10 years ago. And Tel Aviv tries to be a mini Manhattan. Miami, right, that kind of thing, right. The humidity and the beach and that kind of stuff, and then they're not really working nature. We did an interview last night where we were in the Shtachim, and it was like, wow, it was nostalgia. Grew up in the suburbs.
You hear the crickets at night, you see the stars in the sky.
Nice breeze, and not that Jerusalem's not a great breeze as well, but so there's the idea of working with nature, you think would be a lot more helpful.
Right, and reconnecting to it. Part of this project is also learning how to reconnect to our identity. We're going to have to wrap up, by the way. Reconnect to our identity, our connection to the land. Doesn't mean everybody has to become a farmer or a shepherd.
Right.
But we should be able to appreciate and connect to nature. Certainly think about our environment, because the planet is in trouble. And I think there are a lot of measures we can be taking as individuals and certainly as a collective to at least slow down the destruction we're reaping on the planet. And I think Israelis are actually becoming more and more conscious of such issues. So that's good.
All right, again, this has been another episode of the Ari Lewis Show here on Israel Sports and News Radio, also on the YouTube page, The Nation of Israel. Our guest this evening has been Yehuda Hakohen, who's a lecturer at Machon Meir and also the founder of Vision. They can find vision.org.
There's visionmovement.org and visionmag.org. That's our magazine. The movement's official website is visionmovement.org, and the magazine is visionmag.org.
All right. Well, we hope everyone's enjoyed this episode. God bless. Good night.
Thank you.